There comes a moment in every life when the mask you wear begins to feel too tight, not because the world has changed but because you have begun to outgrow the person you were taught to be. Carl Jung called this unfolding process individuation, the long, often painful journey of becoming who you truly are beneath the expectations, fears, and inherited identities. Most people never begin this journey. They remain divided, half living, half performing. But you are not meant to be a repetition of others. You are meant to become whole. Here are 5 keynotes of individuation. The persona is the mask you learn to wear before you even understand you are wearing one. It is shaped by your family, your culture, your education, and every moment you were rewarded for being acceptable instead of being real. At first it feels like identity. It gives you direction, structure, even safety. It tells you how to speak, how to behave, how to be liked, how to avoid rejection. In many ways, it is necessary for survival in the social world. But what begins as a tool slowly becomes a prison when you forget it is not your true face. Carl Jung warned that when a person becomes fully identified with their persona, something essential inside begins to die quietly. Because the persona is not built for truth, it is built for approval. It does not ask, is this real? It asks, will this be accepted? And so a split begins within the psyche. The outer self becomes polished, controlled, and predictable, while the inner self becomes neglected, emotional, and often unseen. Over time, the gap between these two selves creates exhaustion. A person may appear successful, respected, even admired, yet feel strangely hollow inside, as if they are watching their own life instead of living it. The danger is not that the persona exists, but that it becomes absolute. When you begin to believe that the version of you others see is the only version that matters, you start performing even when no performance is required. You smile when there is no joy. You agree when there is no truth. You suppress discomfort, anger, and vulnerability because they do not fit the image you are maintaining. Slowly, you become skilled at being what others expect, but disconnected from what you actually feel. This is where inner conflict begins to grow. The unconscious does not disappear simply because it is ignored. 1. It speaks through restlessness, anxiety, emotional numbness, and moments of quiet dissatisfaction that cannot be explained logically. You may try to fix this emptiness with more achievement, more validation, more distraction, but none of it resolves the core issue, because the problem is not external. It is the disconnection from the self that was left behind in order to maintain the mask. To let the mask fall does not mean to reject society or abandon responsibility. It means to recognize the difference between who you are and who you have been trained to be. It means noticing the moments when you are acting from fear instead of truth. It means allowing yourself to be seen without constant editing, without the pressure to appear flawless or agreeable. This process can feel uncomfortable, because the persona resists change. It was designed to protect you from rejection. But what it protects you from externally, it may also be separating you from internally. Your authenticity, your spontaneity, your aliveness. Jung believed that real growth begins when a person can observe their persona without being consumed by it. In that awareness, a new space opens. You begin to see that you are not the role you play, not the image you project, not the expectations you carry. You are the one who is aware of all of it, and in that awareness, something deeper begins to emerge, something less performative, more grounded, and more real. When the mask starts to fall, it does not mean you become someone new. It means you stop abandoning who you already are. Meet the shadow. What you reject controls you. What you reject within yourself does not disappear. It does not dissolve, weaken, or fade simply because you refuse to acknowledge it. It changes form. It moves into the background of your psyche, where it stops being visible and starts becoming influential. Carl Jung called this hidden domain the shadow, and he did not describe it as something evil or separate from you, but as everything in you that has been denied, suppressed, or left unlived. It contains not only the traits you fear: anger, jealousy, insecurity, desire, but also your untapped strength, creativity, assertiveness, and power that you were never permitted to express. The shadow begins forming early in life. A child quickly learns what is acceptable and what is not. When certain emotions are met with punishment, ridicule, or withdrawal of love, the psyche makes a quiet decision. This part of me must go underground. The rejection is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle, even unintentional. A child who is told to calm down when excited may begin to suppress enthusiasm. A child who is shamed for anger may learn to bury it. A child who is ignored when expressing sadness may stop expressing it altogether. Piece by piece, the personality is shaped not only by what is encouraged, but by what is disallowed. Over time, this creates a divided self. On the surface is the version that is socially rewarded, composed, agreeable, controlled, predictable. Beneath the surface is everything that did not fit into that structure. But what is buried does not remain passive. It accumulates energy. The psyche does not eliminate what it rejects, it relocates it. And what is relocated does not lose its influence, it gains autonomy. This is why people often find themselves reacting in ways they do not fully understand. A person may explode with anger that feels disproportionate to the situation. Another may fall into patterns of self-sabotage just as success becomes possible. Another may feel unexplained jealousy, anxiety, or emptiness that seems to arise without reason. These are not random flaws in character. They are signals from the shadow, expressions of disowned parts of the self attempting to re-enter awareness. Jung emphasized that the shadow is not merely a repository of negative traits. It also contains what a person has not yet dared to become. Many people reject their own strength because it was labeled as arrogance in childhood. They reject their sensitivity because it was called weakness. They reject their ambition because it was considered unrealistic. In this way, the shadow becomes not only a container of pain, but a storage place for unrealized potential. What you refuse to express does not vanish, it waits. The real danger is not that the shadow exists, but that it operates unconsciously. When you do not see it, you do not own it. And what is not owned tends to be projected outward. You begin to see in others what you cannot acknowledge in yourself. The traits you strongly dislike in other people often reveal something unintegrated within your own psyche. Intense judgments, disproportionate emotional reactions, recurring relationship conflicts, these are often referred actions of inner material seeking recognition. For example, a person who denies their own anger may constantly perceive others as aggressive or threatening. A person who denies their own desire may see the world as overly indulgent or corrupt. A person who denies their own vulnerability may criticize others for being weak. The shadow creates distortion in perception because it filters reality through unresolved internal content. In this way, what is unintegrated inside becomes misinterpreted outside. This is why Jung described the shadow as something that controls you when you do not know it. Control here does not mean conscious manipulation, but unconscious influence. You believe you are making rational decisions, yet parts of your behavior are being guided by material you have not faced. Emotional triggers, compulsions, avoidance patterns, and repetitive life situations often originate from this hidden layer of the psyche. To meet the shadow is not a moment of revelation, it is a process of sustained confrontation. It begins with noticing what you habitually reject in yourself, the thoughts you suppress, the emotions you distract yourself from, the impulses you feel ashamed. Instead of immediately pushing them away, you begin to observe them, not to act them out, but to recognize their presence. This act alone begins to dissolve their unconscious power, because what becomes conscious can no longer operate in complete secrecy. At first, this encounter can feel destabilizing. People often fear that acknowledging their shadow means becoming it, but integration is not identification. To recognize anger within yourself does not mean becoming violent. To acknowledge envy does not mean becoming consumed by it. It means reclaiming the energy behind these emotions and understanding what they are pointing toward. Anger often signals violated boundaries. Envy often reveals unclaimed desire. Fear often points to areas of growth that have been avoided. When seen clearly, the shadow loses its chaotic quality and becomes informative. It stops being an enemy and becomes a source of psychological intelligence. But this requires honesty without indulgence. The goal is not to justify every impulse, but to understand its origin. Without awareness, impulses control behavior. With awareness, they become material for transformation. As integration deepens, something unexpected happens. The intensity of projection decreases. Relationships become less distorted by unconscious expectations. Emotional reactions become less automatic. There is more space between stimulus and response. This space is where freedom begins. Because freedom is not the absence of inner forces, but the ability to see them clearly enough that they no longer dictate your actions blindly. Jung believed that the path to wholeness required embracing contradiction. The shadow is not something to eliminate, but to include. A person becomes psychologically whole not by becoming pure, but by becoming complete. Light without shadow is an illusion, it is incompleteness disguised as perfection. True maturity begins when a person can say, "This too is part of me," without collapsing into shame or denial. The integration of the shadow also changes how a person relates to others. Compassion increases, not because judgment disappears, but because projection decreases. You begin to recognize that others are also carrying unseen parts of themselves. You stop demanding perfection from people because you no longer demand it from yourself. You understand that every human being is a mixture of known and unknown, accepted and rejected, conscious and unconscious material. But perhaps the most profound shift occurs internally. As more of the shadow is integrated, energy that was previously spent on suppression becomes available for life. The constant internal resistance begins to lessen. There is less fragmentation, less inner conflict. A person does not become perfect but becomes more aligned. Actions feel less like performance and more like expression. Life becomes less about maintaining control and more about living with awareness. And slowly, a realization emerges. The shadow was never an enemy. It was a part of you waiting to be seen. What you rejected was not trying to destroy you, it was trying to return to you. Stop living the life chosen by others. Most people do not live their own life. They live a carefully constructed version of it, assembled from expectations, inherited beliefs, cultural pressure, and silent agreements they never consciously made. It begins so early that it feels natural. Before a person even has the language to question their direction, the direction is already being shaped. Parents suggest paths, teachers define success, society rewards conformity, and slowly, without realizing it, a person begins to move along a track that feels like life but is actually imitation. Carl Jung understood this as the dominance of the collective over the individual psyche. He observed that human beings are born with a potential self, but that potential is often overwritten by what the world requires them to become. The result is a split existence. One part of the person is living, functioning, achieving, fulfilling roles, while another part remains dormant, quietly observing, often dissatisfied, unable to fully participate in the life being performed in its name. At first, this does not feel like loss. In fact, it often feels like safety. To follow the path laid out by others is to avoid uncertainty. It reduces risk. It provides approval. It gives structure. But what it also does slowly, silently, is remove authorship from your existence. You begin to make decisions not from inner alignment, but from external validation. You choose what is expected rather than what is true. You pursue what is rewarded rather than what is meaningful. And over time you stop asking whether the life you are building is actually yours. This is how psychological captivity begins, not through force but through adaptation. You learn what earns approval and you repeat it. You learn what causes disappointment and you avoid it. You begin to anticipate reactions before they happen. You adjust yourself continuously to fit the emotional environment around you. Eventually you become highly skilled at being acceptable but increasingly disconnected from being authentic. Jung would say that this is the point where the individual becomes over-identified with the persona and underdeveloped in the self. The persona is useful, it allows functioning within society, but when it becomes the primary identity, the deeper self is left unexpressed, and what is unexpressed does not remain silent forever. It manifests as restlessness, dissatisfaction, chronic comparison, or a vague feeling that something essential is missing even when everything appears to be in place. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes from living a life chosen by others. It is not always dramatic. It does not always look like failure. In fact, it often exists alongside success. A person may have achievements, relationships, status, and still feel internally displaced, as if their life is happening slightly outside of them. They participate, but they do not inhabit. They perform, but they do not feel rooted in what they are doing. This disconnection is subtle but persistent. It shows up in moments of silence when distractions fade. It appears as a question that has no clear origin. Is this really it? Not necessarily dissatisfaction with what exists, but a quiet suspicion that something deeper has been overlooked. That suspicion is not weakness. It is awareness trying to return. To stop living the life chosen by others does not mean rejecting guidance or abandoning responsibility. It means recognizing where influence ends and identity begins. It means distinguishing between inherited desire and authentic desire. Many people carry ambitions that were never truly theirs. They pursue careers that were praised, not chosen. They adopt values that were absorbed, not examined. They repeat narratives about success, failure, purpose, and worth that were never personally questioned. Jung believed that individuation requires separation from unconscious identification with the collective. This does not mean isolation from society, but differentiation. The individual must eventually ask, what remains if all external expectations are removed? What choices would still be made if no one were watching, judging, or rewarding? These questions are uncomfortable because they remove the safety of external direction and place responsibility back into the hands of the individual psyche. At this stage, resistance often appears. The mind argues for practicality. It says stability is more important than truth. It says security is better than uncertainty. It says it is too late, too risky, too unrealistic to change direction. These voices are not enemies, they are protective mechanisms shaped by years of conditioning. But protection, when excessive, becomes a limitation. What once prevented harm begins to prevent growth. The deeper issue is not that people do not know what they want, but that they have learned to ignore what they feel. The inner voice does not usually speak loudly. It speaks through inclination, curiosity, discomfort, attraction, resistance. It is not always logical, but it is consistent in tone. Over time, however, it becomes easier to dismiss this inner voice than to follow it, especially when it conflicts with expectation. So people learn to override it. They learn to doubt it. Eventually, they stop recognizing it altogether. Yet it does not disappear. It waits beneath layers of adaptation. It appears in moments of longing that cannot be fully explained. It surfaces in envy, not the destructive kind, but the revealing kind that shows what one secretly desires but has not allowed oneself to pursue. It emerges in fatigue that is not physical but existential, a sense of being tired not because of effort but because of misalignment. To break from the life chosen by others requires a form of internal honesty that is rarely encouraged. It requires admitting that some of what has been built may not reflect who you truly are. This realization can be unsettling because it challenges the narrative of continuity. People prefer to believe that their current path is the natural extension of their identity. To question it feels like destabilizing the past. But Jung would argue that psychological growth often requires precisely this disruption, the willingness to see that continuity does not always equal truth. There is also fear of loss. If you step away from expectations, you may lose approval. You lose certainty. You may even lose relationships that were built around a shared version of who you were supposed to be. This fear is real, but it is also part of the cost of individuation. A life that is truly yours cannot be fully validated by those invested in the version of you that conforms. And yet, remaining within conformity carries its own cost. It is slower, less visible, but deeply erosive. It is the cost of internal disconnection, of waking up years later realizing that much of life was spent fulfilling roles rather than expressing essence. It is the cost of potential unvisited, of curiosity suppressed, of creativity never explored because it did not fit the expected structure. Jung often emphasized that the psyche strives toward wholeness, not comfort. Wholeness sometimes requires disruption of stability. It requires allowing tension between who you have been and who you are becoming. That tension is not a problem to eliminate, but a process to endure. It is the space where transformation occurs. When a person begins to question the life they have inherited, something important shifts internally. Awareness increases. Automatic behavior decreases. Choices become more conscious, even if they are not immediately changed. This awareness is the beginning of freedom, because unconscious living is the opposite of freedom. You cannot change what you do not see, and you cannot choose what you have not recognized. At first, even small acts of authenticity feel significant. Saying no when you would normally say yes. Admitting uncertainty instead of pretending certainty. Choosing something based on interest rather than approval. These are not dramatic changes, but they represent a shift in authority from external validation to internal recognition. Over time, this shift begins to reshape perception. Life is no longer experienced as a fixed script, but as something more flexible, more open. The sense of obligation begins to weaken. The sense of possibility begins to increase. You start to realize that many limitations were not imposed by reality itself, but by interpretation. This does not mean life becomes easy. In fact, it often becomes more demanding, because authenticity requires ongoing awareness. There is no final state where everything becomes clear and settled. Instead, there is a continuous process of alignment and realignment. But what can be done? GES is the quality of experience. Even uncertainty becomes more meaningful when it is connected to self-directed living. Jung would describe this as a movement toward individuation, the gradual emergence of a life that is not merely inherited, but consciously formed. It is not about rejecting the past entirely, but about no longer being governed by it. It is about reclaiming authorship, and perhaps the most profound realization within this process is that no one else can ultimately live your life for you. Others can influence, suggest, and guide, but they cannot inhabit your consciousness. They cannot feel your internal conflict or your internal clarity. Only you can do that, and because of this, the responsibility for authenticity cannot be outsourced indefinitely. To stop living the life chosen by others is to accept this responsibility fully. It is to recognize that even if the path is uncertain, even if the direction is not fully formed, it is still more honest to walk toward what is real than to remain perfectly aligned with what is not. It is to choose participation in your own existence rather than observation of it, and in that choice, something begins to return, not immediately, not completely, but gradually. A sense of ownership, a sense of presence, a sense that life is no longer something happening around you, but something being lived from within you. The unconscious speaks in symbols. Learn to listen. The unconscious does not speak in the language of logic, structure, or direct explanation. It does not argue, prove, or conclude. Instead, it communicates through symbols, through images, emotions, patterns, dreams, and repeated experiences that seem to carry meaning without ever stating it directly. Carl Jung spent his life studying this hidden language of the psyche, and he discovered something profound. The deeper mind is not silent, but poetic. It does not tell you what to think, it shows you what you have not yet understood. From the moment you are born, your conscious mind begins to develop a way of interpreting the world through language and reason. You learn names for things, categories for experiences, and explanations for events. This rational layer of the mind is essential for functioning in reality, but beneath it exists another layer, older, deeper, and far less linear. This is the unconscious, and it does not think in sentences. It thinks in images, sensations, and emotional patterns. Where the conscious mind says this is what happened, the unconscious says this is what it means. This difference is crucial, because meaning is not always visible on the surface of life. Two people can experience the same event and carry completely different psychological realities from it. One moment in childhood, one relationship, one failure or success can echo through a lifetime, not because of its external importance, but because of the symbolic weight the unconscious attaches to it. Dreams are one of the most direct expressions of this symbolic language. In dreams, the mind does not obey the rules of time, logic, or physics. People appear who are no longer present in your life. Places transform without explanation. Events merge, collapse, and shift in ways that make no rational sense, yet feel emotionally precise. Jung believed this was not random chaos, but communication. The unconscious uses metaphor because metaphor can carry emotional truth more accurately than literal explanation. For example, a person who dreams of being lost in a vast, endless city may not be receiving information about geography, but about internal disorientation. Someone who dreams of drowning may not be predicting danger, but expressing emotional overwhelm. A locked door in a dream may not represent a physical barrier, but an inner potential that has not yet been accessed. The unconscious does not speak directly because direct language belongs to the conscious mind. Instead, it translates psychological reality into symbolic experience. But dreams are only one form of this communication. The unconscious also speaks through repetition in daily life. When the same emotional pattern appears again and again, different people, different situations, but the same outcome, it is rarely coincidence. It is pattern. And pattern is one of the primary ways the unconscious draws attention to unresolved material. If something keeps happening, it is often because something within has not yet been understood. For instance, a person who repeatedly finds themselves in relationships where they feel unseen or unvalued may not simply be unlucky. The unconscious may be expressing an unresolved belief about worthiness. Another person who constantly experiences conflict with authority figures may be encountering an internal struggle with control or validation. The outer world, in this sense, becomes a stage where inner dynamics are repeatedly acted out until they are finally recognized. Even emotional reactions are symbolic. A disproportionate emotional response is rarely about the immediate situation alone. It often signals that something deeper has been activated, A small criticism that triggers overwhelming shame may be connected to older experiences of rejection. A minor setback that produces intense despair may be touching a deeper narrative about failure or inadequacy stored in the unconscious. The emotion is not just about now, it is about layers of time compressed into a single moment. Jung emphasized that the unconscious is not irrational, it is non-rational. This distinction matters. Irrationality implies chaos or nonsense, but the unconscious is structured in its own way. It follows association, emotion, and symbolic correspondence rather than linear logic. It connects things based on meaning, not surface similarity. This is why seemingly unrelated experiences can feel deeply connected on an inner level. The challenge is that modern life trains people almost exclusively in rational interpretation. You are to analyze, measure, categorize, and explain, but you are rarely taught to interpret symbols. As a result, many people experience their inner life as confusing or random when, in reality, it is structured in a different language they have not learned to read. To learn to listen to the unconscious is to begin paying attention differently. It requires slowing down the automatic dismissal of inner experiences as just thoughts, or just dreams, or just coincidence. Instead, it asks a question. What is this pointing toward? Not in a superstitious way, but in a reflective way. What pattern is repeating? What emotion keeps resurfacing? What image or idea keeps returning without invitation? At first, this way of listening can feel unfamiliar, because it shifts authority from external explanation to internal reflection. You stop immediately outsourcing meaning to logic alone and begin allowing space for symbolic understanding. This does not mean abandoning reason, it means expanding perception. The unconscious does not replace logic, it completes it. Jung believed that when the unconscious is ignored, it does not remain passive. It compensates, it sends stronger signals, it intensifies dreams, amplifies emotional reactions, and increases repetition in life patterns. It does this not to punish, but to be heard. Because what is not acknowledged does not disappear, it becomes louder in indirect ways. There is a reason symbols appear universally across human cultures. Certain images, water, darkness, light, descent, flight, animals, thresholds carry meanings that are not learned but felt. These archetypal symbols are part of what Jung called the collective unconscious, a shared layer of human experience that expresses itself through recurring patterns across time and culture. This is why myths, stories, and religions often feel strangely familiar even when encountered for the first time. They are speaking in the same symbolic language that the psyche itself uses. But the most important symbols are not always grand or mythological. Often they are deeply personal. A specific place that appears in dreams, a recurring scenario in imagination, a persistent emotional theme in life. These are highly individualized symbolic expressions. The unconscious speaks in a dialect unique to your own psychological history, shaped by your experiences, memories, and unresolved tensions. To truly listen requires honesty, not interpretation forced into rigid answers. The unconscious does not provide simple instructions. It offers direction through feeling, resonance, and recognition. When something symbolic clicks, it is not because it has been logically proven, but because it has been felt as true at a deeper level. This is why Jung placed such importance on inner dialogue with the unconscious. He did not treat it as something distant or abstract, but as an active part of the self that can be engaged with. Through dreams, reflection, and active imagination, a person can begin to form a relationship with their inner world rather than treating it as background noise. As this relationship deepens, something subtle begins to change. Life starts to feel less random and more meaningful, not because external events become easier, but because internal awareness increases. You begin to recognize that many of your experiences are not isolated incidents, but interconnected expressions of ongoing inner processes. The world becomes less of a disconnected sequence of events and more of a mirror reflecting psychological reality. This does not mean every event has a hidden mystical meaning. Jung was careful not to reduce reality into fantasy. Instead, he pointed to a dual perspective. External events are real, but their impact is shaped by internal meaning. The unconscious does not change what happens, it changes how what happens is experienced and integrated. When a person learns to listen to this symbolic language, they begin to recover something essential: dialogue with themselves. Not the surface-level self that speaks in plans and worries, but the deeper self that speaks in patterns and images. This dialogue is not always comfortable. Sometimes the unconscious reveals truths that are difficult to accept. Sometimes it points toward change that feels uncertain or challenging, but it always moves toward wholeness, not fragmentation. Jung believed that the unconscious is not separate from you, it is part of you that has not yet entered awareness. In that sense, its symbols are not foreign messages, but unfinished aspects of your own life trying to become understood. To listen is not to decode something external, but to integrate something internal. And gradually, as attention shifts from ignoring to noticing, from dismissing to reflecting, a transformation begins. The inner world becomes less chaotic, not because it changes, but because it is finally being seen. And in being seen, it begins to make sense in a way that is not purely logical, but deeply human. The unconscious does not stop speaking simply because you are not listening. It does not wait for permission, nor does it adjust itself to your level of awareness. It continues to express itself continuously, silently shaping your perceptions, reactions, relationships, and decisions in ways that often feel like just life happening, when in reality, it is life being filtered through layers of unrecognized inner meaning. Carl Jung described this as the psyche's natural drive toward wholeness, a movement that persists even when the conscious mind resists it. And at the center of this movement is symbolic language, the only language the unconscious truly knows. To understand this is to realize that most people are not disconnected from their unconscious because it is absent, but because they have not learned how to interpret its form of communication. The modern mind is trained to prioritize literal meaning. Words are expected to be direct, explanations are expected to be linear, and truth is expected to be measurable. But the unconscious does not operate within these constraints. It expresses itself through metaphor, repetition, emotional intensity, coincidence, imagery, dreams, bodily sensations, and patterns that only reveal their meaning when observed over time rather than analyzed in isolation. A single dream may seem meaningless if taken literally, but when viewed as symbolic expression, it becomes a compressed psychological narrative. A storm may not be weather, it may be emotional turbulence. A house may not be architecture, it may represent the structure of the self, with different rooms symbolizing different layers of consciousness. A falling sensation may not be physical, it may reflect loss of control, uncertainty, or ego destabilization. The unconscious compresses complex emotional truths into images because images carry multidimensional meaning without needing explanation. But symbolic communication is not limited to dreams alone. It extends into waking life in ways that most people overlook. Repetition is one of its most consistent forms. When similar situations keep appearing in different forms, different faces, differ in mental environments, but the same emotional outcome, it is often not coincidence but pattern repetition driven by unresolved inner material. The psyche recreates scenarios until the underlying meaning is recognized. It is not punishment, it is insistence. What is unintegrated seeks expression through recurrence. A person who repeatedly experiences abandonment in relationships may not simply be encountering external instability. There may be an internal symbolic structure at work, a deeply embedded expectation of loss, or an unconscious identification with unworthiness that shapes perception and behavior. The outer world becomes a stage where inner assumptions are continuously reenacted. Until the pattern is seen, it remains invisible yet active. Once seen, it begins to lose its compulsive force because awareness interrupts repetition. Even emotions themselves are symbolic messengers. Emotions are not merely reactions to external events, they are interpretations of meaning generated by the unconscious. An emotion that feels sudden or disproportionate is often not about the present moment alone, but about the activation of deeper layers of experience. A minor rejection may awaken an old memory of invisibility. A small failure may trigger a larger internal narrative of inadequacy. The emotional intensity is not always proportional to the current situation because it carries the weight of accumulated psychological history. Jung emphasized that the unconscious is not chaotic, but structured according to association rather than logic. This means it connects experiences based on emotional similarity, not chronological order. Two moments separated by years can be psychologically linked if they carry the same emotional signature. This is why a present event can feel heavier than it should. It is not the event alone being experienced, but a network of symbolic associations being activated simultaneously. When the unconscious is ignored, it does not retreat, it compensates, it intensifies its communication. If subtle signals are dismissed, it may express itself through stronger emotional reactions, recurring dreams, physical symptoms, or persistent life patterns that cannot be easily resolved through surface-level adjustments. This is not a malfunction of the psyche, but its attempt to restore balance, working toward integration, even if its methods feel disruptive. The difficulty is that symbolic language requires interpretation, and interpretation requires patience. Modern consciousness prefers immediacy. It wants answers that are clear, final, and efficient. But symbolic understanding does not operate in finality. It unfolds gradually. A symbol does not have a single meaning, it has layers of meaning that reveal themselves over time as the individual's awareness deepens. The same image or pattern may mean one thing at one stage of life and something entirely different at another. This is why Jung saw the psyche as a dynamic system rather than a fixed structure. The unconscious evolves alongside consciousness. As you grow, the symbols change. What once appeared as confusion may later reveal itself as guidance. What once felt like disturbance may later be understood as transition. The meaning was not absent before, it was simply inaccessible until the mind developed the capacity to recognize it. There is also a collective dimension to symbolic language. Certain symbols appear across cultures, myths, and historical narratives because they reflect shared psychological structures. Water often represents the unconscious itself, reflecting depth, emotion, and the unknown. Descent often symbolizes confrontation with inner darkness. Light often represents awareness or insight. The journey, the threshold, the labyrinth, the shadow, the hero, these are not random cultural inventions but recurring patterns of human psychological experience expressed through symbolic form. Yet the most powerful symbols are often personal. A specific recurring place in dreams, a familiar emotional atmosphere that appears in different contexts, a repeated type of relationship dynamic. These are deeply individualized expressions of unconscious material. They are not meant to be decoded through rigid universal definitions, but understood through personal reflection. The unconscious speaks in a dialect shaped by your own life history, and learning it requires attention to your unique emotional patterns rather than external interpretations alone. To begin listening is to shift from reacting to reflecting. Instead of immediately dismissing inner experiences as meaningless, you pause and observe them. You notice what repeats. You notice what intensifies your emotions. You notice what images arise in dreams or imagination without deliberate effort. You begin to treat these not as noise, but as information. Not information in the logical sense, but in the psychological sense, signals pointing toward areas of inner life that are active but not yet fully conscious. This process often begins subtly. A person may start noticing that certain themes keep appearing in their thoughts, or that certain emotional reactions feel familiar in different situations, or that certain dreams leave a lingering feeling that cannot be explained away. At first, these observations may seem insignificant, but over time they form a pattern. And pattern recognition is the beginning of symbolic understanding. Jung believed that when a person begins to engage with the unconscious consciously, a dialogue begins to form. Not a literal conversation, but an evolving relationship between awareness and the deeper psyche. This relationship is not about control or mastery, but about recognition. The unconscious is not something to dominate, but something to integrate. It contains not only unresolved pain, but also unrealized potential. Many people fear the unconscious because it reveals what has been avoided. But avoidance does not eliminate content, it only relocates it. What is not acknowledged remains active beneath awareness, influencing perception without consent. When brought into awareness, however, it loses its hidden power. It becomes something that can be understood, rather than something that controls behavior indirectly. This is why symbolic understanding is transformative. It does not change external reality directly, but it changes the relationship between consciousness and experience. Events that once felt random begin to feel connected. Emotional reactions that once felt confusing begin to feel meaningful. Inner life becomes less fragmented because previously separated parts begin to communicate through awareness. As this process continues, something profound begins to emerge. The sense that life is not only happening externally but also unfolding internally in parallel. The outer world and inner world are not separate systems, but interwoven layers of experience. What happens outside is filtered through what exists inside, and what exists inside shapes how the outside is perceived. Symbols are the bridge between these two layers. To listen to the unconscious is not to abandon rational thinking but to expand perception beyond it. It is to recognize that not all truth is expressed in literal form. Some truths must be felt, imagined, or recognized through pattern rather than explained through logic. The unconscious speaks constantly, but softly, not because it is weak, but because its language requires attention rather than force. And slowly, as attention deepens, the symbolic world becomes more visible. Dreams feel less random, emotional reactions feel less arbitrary, repeated patterns become more noticeable. Inner life becomes less like static and more like communication, not always clear, not always comfortable, but increasingly meaningful. And in that meaning, something fundamental shifts. The unconscious is no longer experienced as distant or separate. It becomes recognized as part of the same self that thinks, chooses, and lives. Not beneath you, not above you, but within you, speaking in symbols, waiting not to control you, but to be understood. Wholeness is the goal, not perfection. Wholeness is not a destination where everything inside you becomes clean, orderly, and permanently resolved. It is not the achievement of a flawless personality, nor the elimination of contradiction, nor the arrival at a state where doubt, emotion, conflict, or inner tension no longer exist. Carl Jung was very clear on this. The human psyche is not designed to become perfect, it is designed to become complete. And completion does not mean uniformity, it means inclusion. Most people grow up with an unconscious belief that progress means improvement in a linear sense. Be better, be stronger, be more disciplined, be less emotional, be more rational, remove weakness, eliminate inconsistency, fix flaws. This creates an internal ideal that the personality is constantly measured against, and inevitably, the real self begins to feel insufficient. A gap forms between what you are and what you think you should be. That gap becomes the source of inner pressure, self-judgment, and quiet dissatisfaction that never fully disappears, even when external success is achieved. Jung observed that this pursuit of perfection often leads not to wholeness, but to fragmentation, because in trying to become only the acceptable parts of yourself, you begin to exile everything else. Anger is pushed away because it feels uncontrolled. Vulnerability is hidden because it feels unsafe. Desire is suppressed because it feels inappropriate. Doubt is rejected because it feels weak. Slowly, the personality becomes narrower, more rigid, more socially functional, but internally divided. What is excluded does not cease to exist. It remains active in the unconscious, shaping behavior indirectly. This is why people who appear highly controlled can still experience sudden emotional breakdowns, compulsive behaviors, or repeated life patterns that seem to contradict their conscious intentions. The more you try to eliminate parts of yourself, the more power those parts gain in hidden form. Perfection, in this sense, is not stability, it is internal pressure without release. Wholeness begins when this struggle against parts of the self starts to loosen, not through indulgence, but through recognition. You begin to notice that the traits you were trying to eliminate are not separate entities attacking you, but aspects of your own psyche attempting to exist. Anger is not simply destruction, it is also boundary protection. Fear is not only weakness, it is also awareness of vulnerability. Sadness is not failure, it is processing. Even qualities that seem undesirable often carry necessary psychological functions when understood in context. Jung's idea of wholeness includes something radical: the integration of opposites. A person is not only one thing, they are structured around tension, strength and sensitivity, confidence and doubt, discipline and spontaneity, rationality and emotion all coexist within the same psyche. The goal is not to eliminate one side in favor of the other, but to develop the capacity to hold both without fragmentation. This does not mean acting on every impulse, but it does mean acknowledging that every impulse belongs to the psychological whole. Perfection demands exclusion, wholeness demands inclusion, and this is where the shift in consciousness begins. Instead of asking, "How do I remove this part of me?" the question slowly becomes, "What is this part trying to express?" This simple shift changes the relationship to inner experience. It moves from rejection to curiosity, from suppression to understanding, and in that shift, internal conflict begins to soften. A perfection-based identity is always under pressure because it is fragile. It must constantly maintain an image. It must avoid contradiction. It must remain consistent. But human beings are not internally consistent in a static way. They are dynamic, changing, and often contradictory depending on context, emotion, and experience. Trying to freeze this complexity into a single ideal creates tension that eventually breaks through in unexpected ways. By contrast, is flexible. It does not require you to be the same in every moment. It allows for emotional variation without self-rejection. It allows for uncertainty without collapse. It allows for imperfection without shame. This does not mean a lack of direction, it means a deeper stability that does not depend on being flawless. It is stability rooted in awareness, not control. As integration deepens, something important happens to self-judgment. The internal voice that constantly evaluates, criticizes, and compares begins to lose its authority, not because it disappears completely, but because it is no longer treated as absolute truth. You begin to see it as one part of the psyche rather than the voice of total reality. This creates psychological space, and in that space, something new becomes possible. Self-observation without immediate self-condemnation. This is where real transformation begins. Not in becoming perfect, but in becoming conscious. Because consciousness allows choice while unconsciousness produces compulsion. A person who is unaware of their anger is controlled by it. A person who is aware of their anger can understand it, regulate it, and express it appropriately. Awareness does not eliminate emotion, it changes relationship to emotion. Jung believed that wholeness is the natural direction of the psyche. The unconscious continuously pushes toward integration, not fragmentation. This is why inner conflict often intensifies before it resolves. The psyche brings suppressed material into awareness not to overwhelm the individual, but to reintegrate what has been split off. This process can feel uncomfortable because it challenges identity structures built over years. But discomfort in this context is not a sign of failure, it is a sign of reorganization. There is also a deep psychological relief that comes with letting go of perfection as a goal. It removes the constant pressure of needing to be other than what you are in this moment. It replaces self-criticism with self-awareness. It does not remove responsibility, but it removes unnecessary internal hostility. Life becomes less about self-correction at every moment and more about continuous understanding and adjustment. In wholeness, nothing essential is denied. Even contradictions are allowed to coexist. You can be confident and uncertain. You can be strong and vulnerable. You can be disciplined and emotionally complex. These are not errors in the system, they are the system. The psyche is not a straight line, it is a living structure with depth, layers, and movement. Over time, this perspective changes how you relate to others as well. When you stop demanding perfection from yourself internally, you stop demanding it from others externally. You begin to recognize that everyone is carrying their own internal contradictions, their own shadow, their own unresolved material. Judgment softens, not because discernment disappears, but because understanding increases. And perhaps the most important realization within this shift is that wholeness is not something you achieve once and secure forever. It is something you return to repeatedly. It is a way of relating to yourself that deepens over time. Some moments feel more integrated, others more fragmented. But even fragmentation is no longer seen as failure, it is seen as part of the ongoing process. Jung's vision was not of a perfected human being, but of an integrated one. A person who is aware of their complexity and no longer at war with it. A person who can hold tension without collapsing into extreme. A person who does not need to be flawless to feel real. And in that understanding, something quietly shifts. The pursuit of perfection loses its grip, not because effort ends, but because the direction changes. You are no longer moving toward an impossible ideal. You are moving toward yourself fully, honestly, and completely, with everything included. Final reflection: expend it more lengthy without heading in the end. What Jung points toward is not a theory to be admired from a distance, but a lived recognition that changes how a person relates to their own existence. The final reflection is not an ending in the usual sense, because individuation does not conclude like a finished task. It is more like a continuous unfolding, a deepening relationship with oneself that never becomes fully complete, only more conscious over time. When a person begins this journey, there is often an expectation, sometimes subtle, sometimes strong, that clarity will eventually arrive in a final form, that one day everything inside will align, all confusion will disappear, and a stable identity will remain. But Jung's understanding of the psyche does not support this idea of final psychological perfection. Instead, it suggests something far more human and far more demanding. That wholeness is not the elimination of contradiction, but the ability to hold contradiction without fragmentation. This means that even at advanced stages of inner growth, uncertainty does not vanish, conflict does not disappear entirely. Doubt, emotion, tension, and complexity remain part of life. What changes is not the presence of these experiences, but your relationship to them. where once they may have felt overwhelming, chaotic, or controlling, they gradually become understandable, integrated, and less threatening. The inner world does not become silent, it becomes intelligible. The final reflection, then, is the realization that you are not trying to become someone entirely different from who you are. You are not escaping yourself, nor are you replacing yourself with an ideal version imagined in abstraction. Instead, you are becoming more fully what you already are, but in a fragmented form. The work is not construction but integration, not addition but recognition, not invention but reunion. There is a quiet reversal that happens in this understanding. At first, a person believes they must to move away from certain parts of themselves in order to become better, away from weakness, away from confusion, away from emotional instability, away from shadow aspects that feel unacceptable. But over time it becomes clear that separation is what created suffering in the first place. The more one rejects inner parts of the self, the more divided life becomes. And the more divided life becomes, the more external reality feels disordered, because inner fragmentation always projects outward. So the path is not upward in a linear sense, but inward in a circular one. It is a return not to ignorance but to wholeness, a return that includes awareness, a return that does not erase what has been learned, but recontextualizes it within a larger understanding of the self. There is also a deep shift in how meaning is experienced. Early in life, meaning is often sought externally through achievement, recognition, relationships, or identity roles. But as individuation progresses, meaning becomes less dependent on external validation and more rooted in internal alignment. Life does not necessarily become easier, but it becomes more coherent. Even difficult experiences begin to feel less like key random suffering and more like part of a larger psychological process that is unfolding through you, not merely happening to you. This does not mean everything has a simple explanation or that pain becomes justified in a comforting way. Rather, it means that experience begins to feel less disconnected. The psyche starts to reveal continuity beneath apparent chaos. Patterns become visible. Inner themes become recognizable. What once felt like isolated moments begin to appear as chapters of a longer inner story. In this way, the unconscious is no longer something that intrudes unpredictably into life. It becomes something that participates in life continuously. It is no longer other, but integrated into awareness as part of a larger totality. And this recognition changes the quality of being itself. There is less inner resistance, less fragmentation between who you think you are and what you experience yourself to be. Jung often suggested that the goal of psychological development is not superiority, but wholeness. And wholeness is not a state of perfection, it is a state of inclusion. It is the ability to acknowledge that everything within you, both light and shadow, both clarity and confusion, both strength and vulnerability, belongs to the same psychological system. Nothing is entirely removed, nothing is fully excluded. Everything is held within a larger awareness that can contain complexity without collapsing under it. At this stage, life begins to feel less like a performance and more like participation, less like something you are trying to get right, and more like something you are learning to experience fully. The pressure to become someone else gradually dissolves, replaced by a quieter responsibility to remain conscious of what is already unfolding within you. And perhaps the most profound aspect of this final reflection is the realization that the journey was never about becoming distant from yourself, but about becoming closer to what was always present beneath conditioning, fear, and adaptation. What you were searching for externally was always intertwined with what was waiting internally to be recognized. In this sense, individuation is not the creation of a new self, but the gradual uncovering of a more complete one. And even though this process does not reach a final endpoint in the way the mind often expects, it does reach moments of clarity, moments where the fragmented parts feel less separated, where inner conflict softens, and where a quiet sense of coherence emerges. Not perfection, not completion, but integration. And in that integration, life does not become a solved problem, it becomes a lived experience that is finally seen more fully, more honestly, and more completely from within.